This episode contains graphic descriptions of real medical scenarios faced by real medical professionals. Listener discretion is advised. From Knowledgeable Provider, this is Critical Incident. Hey, welcome back to Critical Incident from Knowledgeable Provider. I'm Jody Marks. I haven't done many of these Critical Incident episodes in quite a while. The initial thought with this different kind of episode was to get away from academic clinical stuff and talk about the more real-world practical side of medicine and just share stories of things that we collectively have been through. I've told a lot of stories from my own personal experience on here. I was hoping I would get a flood of other people wanting to talk about their personal experiences on here, but so far that's not happened. And at this point, I've probably told most of the memorable stories that I have from my career, at least the ones that I'm comfortable telling. And for better or for worse, I'm not really someone who dwells on things that I've done. I've never been prone to nightmares, flashbacks. I don't tend to sit around and ruminate about stuff that I've been involved in over the years. And a lot of stuff I just plain forget. A friend that I used to work with at the ambulance service called me out of the blue the other day. I hadn't talked to him in a long time, and he told me this story of a call that I allegedly was involved in. He was like, yeah, you and so ran this call together, and there was a hostage situation, and the guy ended up killing himself and shooting this lady in the head, and you were dealing with this lady, and this happened, and you were doing this and that. And I literally have no memory of this at all. And that's happened to me a few times in the past where somebody will be reminiscing and will tell me a story about some call that we supposedly ran together. And I'm like, I don't think that was me. I think you remember that wrong. One of us is wrong. But at any rate, I don't think I have very many more stories to tell from my own experience, at least not that would make for interesting podcasting. I think what I do currently is very interesting, and I have a lot of interesting things that I could talk about, but I don't know that it would be very interesting to people who are listening. Definitely not as interesting as wild things that happen out on the ambulance or in the ICU. But as I was driving home today, I was listening to last week's Critical Incident episode. If you haven't listened to it yet, you should go back and listen to it before you listen to what I'm about to talk about. There are some spoilers in here, and this was inspired by the most recent episode. It's a great interview with Rick Canelia about his experiences with military medicine. And in that episode, here comes a spoiler, he was talking about a situation where he was in charge of caring for a group of enemy POWs, and he had to make a decision about this one particular soldier who had what seemed like a brain injury and needed to be transported to a hospital. And at the time, at that moment, they were in a situation where the American medevac helicopters were needed to take care of American soldiers who were off fighting elsewhere. And Rick made the decision to put this guy on a bus and send him to the hospital by ground instead of trying to get a helicopter for him. And it was very obvious that that was a decision that he has thought a lot about, that has stuck with him, to say the least. And as we were talking, as he was telling me that story, he said something to the effect of, maybe you know what this feels like, or maybe you will have to make a decision like this at some point. And I kind of laughed internally. I thought, yeah, I definitely know what that feels like. I've definitely made a lot of decisions like that in my career. One thing Rick told me as we were getting ready for that interview, when he was sharing his bio with me, his list of accomplishments, he wanted to make it very clear that he was not trying to brag. He said, this is just what you do. Like any other military officer would have the same kinds of stories. That's just another day at the office for us, right? And that's exactly how I felt about him talking about making these life or death decisions when you work in medicine, and in a lot of different roles. But in my experience, primarily when I worked as a paramedic, that was all about being out in the field in undesirable circumstances and having to make important decisions that sometimes do impact people's lives based on the information you have in front of you, the resources you have available at the time, whatever the situation dictates. And anyone who has similar experience would have a ton of similar stories. That's just what it is. That's just the job. And I'm always very careful about comparing any of my civilian experience to military experience because I know that I don't know what it's like to be off in combat and do those things. But in this particular instance that he was talking about, trying to make a transport decision for a very sick patient with limited resources, 100%, I've been in similar situations and I know what that feels like. So thinking about this brought up some memories of some stories, and I don't think I've shared many of these on the podcast before. If I have, I apologize. But I think I came up with enough to make an episode out of. I've titled the episode Playing God because those were Rick's words. He said he felt that he was playing God when he made that decision of how to transport that patient. And I reacted pretty strongly to that because I do not think that constitutes playing God whatsoever. I think when you're in those situations, anyone is just trying to do the best they can given the circumstances in front of them. I think it might be playing God, quote unquote, if you make a decision that ends up causing someone harm when you could have just as easily done something else, right? If you're actively doing something that you know is going to kill a person when you could have just as easily done something else, that would be playing God. Or if you're choosing one life over another in a situation where you actually have a choice, where there's not some circumstance that dictates your decision, then you're playing God. But that's never been my experience. I've only ever been in situations where I just had to do the best I could do. When I was in college, a lot of times I would work night shift at the ambulance service and then show up for my morning class fresh from work, still in my uniform and whatnot, and then proceed to sleep through the class more often than not. But I remember this one particular day I walked into class in uniform, and somehow this conversation got started where these girls were asking me, well, what if I'm pregnant and I have an accident and I die? Who makes the decision about whether or not to save my baby? And in thinking about my answer to that, I kind of went the direction of it's not really a choice, like you're either dead or you're not. There's a situation where we might be able to save your baby or there's not. Obviously, we're going to do everything we can, but it's not that I or anybody like me is ever going to actively choose whether or not we're saving your baby. Like either it's a situation where you can or it's a situation where you can't. And they really did not like my answer. Maybe I didn't put it that clearly, or maybe I said it differently than I remember now. But I remember it kind of turned into a heated discussion. And maybe people looking from the outside kind of see these situations differently. I don't know. But here's some specific stories that I've been involved in no particular order. I mentioned this situation even on last week's episode about the infamous bloody shoe from that horrible call that I ran very, very early in my career. And I've talked about that in detail in previous episodes. But even in that situation, I'm the person who ultimately made the decision not to try to resuscitate the one patient who was dead when we got there. And we arrive and we're out in the middle of nowhere. BFE, if you want to look up what that stands for, if you don't already know. I got one ambulance. Any help is at least 30, 40 minutes away. Hell, it probably took us 30, 40 minutes to get there in the first place. I got one pulseless and apneic. I got one with a pulse and agonal respirations, and I got one that seems okay. And right there at that moment, with only one ambulance, with only one me, that's a mass casualty incident, right? There's more problems than there are resources to deal with them. So what do? Okay, triage, right? This guy's fine. You go over there and wait. This guy's dead. We're getting him out of the way. We're devoting our resources to the one who's still alive but clearly very sick. Unquestionably the right decision. Doesn't necessarily make it easier that we didn't try to do anything to help that other kid. And these are kids we're dealing with, which of course makes it 100 times more difficult for everybody to deal with. If there had only been the one patient, if there had only been the one kid who was pulseless and apneic when we got there, might we have worked him, even though you're really not supposed to do that with a trauma arrest? Yeah, we might have. And maybe that's what made it so hard for some people to swallow. But that is the kind of decision that can stick with you, even if you feel you made the right choice or you didn't even have a choice, right? I ran another call out there in that same area, probably around the same time. Same kind of deal, way the heck out in the country in the middle of nowhere. It's me and my one ambulance. We run this little pickup truck that's flipped over. Two patients. One of them either was already out of the truck when we got there or was not super difficult to get out of the truck. The other patient, not only are they trapped under the truck, but their loaded 30-06 deer rifle is between them and the ground. So we're trying to figure out how to maneuver this guy out without hurting him or us. And in the meantime, we got this other patient who's already out, who's ready to go. So I'm looking around. There's another truck on the way from town, which is, a good 30 minutes or so. But I know there's another ambulance coming. I got one ambulance. I got one patient that needs to go. I'm like, there's no sense making that patient wait on us to dick around and try to figure out what we're going to do with this other one. So I jump in the ambulance. I pull out a bunch of stuff that I think I might need, and I send them on, Maybe I'd even do the ambush slaps, right? Where you, on TV, they always close the back doors and pop, slap the back doors. I sent them on their way. I stayed with the patient that was trapped, and I did whatever we did with him. And I took a lot of criticism for that. I'm still not even sure why to this day. I believe I did turn over that other patient to a lower level EMT. I think I was probably an intermediate at the time, and I might have asked a basic to ride in with that other patient. But I don't see how that's the wrong decision. One night later on in my career, we get dispatched to, I think it probably came out as a miscarriage, because I don't recall there being any great sense of urgency at any point. And the place we got sent to was a known, I'm going to say crack house. I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory, offensive way. And maybe I'm completely wrong about that, but I had been there multiple times for situations where it seemed like people were overdosing on drugs, and just looking around the place, we're talking like house with nothing in it other than mattresses on the floors and people laying around passed out. And it just seemed like a place where people went to use drugs, whatever you want to call that. That's where we were going. It's in the middle of the night, of course. We get there, and I'll never forget this woman's affect. She was in a pretty good mood, really. She was kind of chatty and laughing with us, and it was as if we had just seen her in a restaurant and waved and had a pleasant conversation. It was very, very odd affect for what was going on. And we're always taught you don't judge people for how they react to adversity. Everybody reacts differently to sad things and difficult things and whatever. So far be it from me to judge, but it struck me as odd. I remember that. And so we're chitty chatting with this woman. And finally we get around to, at this point I have not seen whatever it was that she birthed or passed or whatever you want to call it. I've not seen what came out of her. And so I finally got to the point where I had to ask, okay, well, where is it? Where is whatever came out of you? And she goes, oh, it's right here in my pants. Okay. So peer inside this woman's sweatpants, and sure enough, there's a big blob of whatever you want to call it. I'll call it dead baby for lack of better terminology. So I reach in there and fish it all out. I must have cut the cord. I don't really remember doing that, but it had to have been done at some point. And there was no question that it was dead. At least in my mind at that time, there was no question that it was dead. So we load the lady up. I put the, whatever we're calling this massive thing she had just birthed, I put it in a red, biohazard trash bag, and we go on to the hospital. We drop them off. We leave. End of story. Sad, but we move on. And only in retrospect have I kind of realized that baby was further along than I thought at the time. I don't know what everybody else's paramedic training is like, but I got virtually no OB training in paramedic school. You read about it in a textbook and you memorize the steps of how to deliver a baby, maybe even practice on a mannequin that's made to practice that on. So in theory, you learn how to deliver a baby. We got very minimal time in OB in paramedic school. And honestly, my OB rotations consisted of standing out at the nurse's desk in the OB unit because either there was nobody there having a baby that day or nobody would allow a male paramedic student to be in the room while that was happening. So for really my whole career in EMS, I had no useful training or experience with OB kind of things. But then, of course, when I became a nurse, I went into pediatric ICU and I learned more about caring for babies. And what I know now looking back is that may have actually been a full-term baby. At the time, I thought, oh, it's not viable. It's dead. It's early miscarriage. Nobody ever questioned the decision that we made. But if I could go right back to that moment right now, I would code that baby 100%. Another one that has stuck with me, we ran a call where this guy flipped his SUV over into a cotton field, a field off by the side of the road. And he was partially ejected. He came out the driver's side window. His torso's out of the vehicle, right? The bottom half of him is still in the vehicle. The truck's laying on top of him. And he's pulseless, apneic. He's dead. Well, I really remember this vividly. There's a particular song that every time I hear it, I think about this call. And I don't know, in my memory, I think maybe the song was actually playing on the radio when we left that scene or so. I don't know. There's some connection in my head between this particular, it's a Nickelback song, actually. It's called Never Gonna Be Alone. I don't know why that song, but every time I hear it, I'm right back under this truck with this dude. So we all scramble under there. We crawl under there. I'm checking him, no pulse, no breathing, dead. The firefighter crawls under there with me and he goes, do you want us to lift the truck off of this guy? And at the time, I'm thinking, he's dead. We don't code trauma arrests. If we start doing anything, then we're doing something. We have to work it, So I said, no, don't worry about it. So we didn't. We left the guy sitting there under his truck. Everybody kind of leaves, except me. This is what lets me know that I was second guessing that decision even at the time. I sat my ass right there on that scene until the coroner or the medical examiner, whoever got there, and it came to the point where, okay, we've done our investigation, whatever, now we are going to pull this body out of this truck. I stayed my ass right there in the ambulance waiting for all that to happen, and then I went right back down to where I'd been and checked him again because of a past call, which I know I've talked about on the podcast, where I was the third or fourth or fifth unit to show up at this horrible, terrible wreck, and there were 2 dead people who had been checked by everyone else, and so we didn't pay attention to them, and as we were leaving, they turned out not to be dead. Somebody comes running up and goes, hey, these dudes are breathing. And so I think because of that situation, when I found myself in this situation, I'm like, I'm not going to be the person who leaves an alive patient and doesn't do anything, but I don't understand why I didn't just say, yes, let's lift the truck off of him and pull him out and see what we have at that point, and then we'll make a decision. I wish I had. Another situation right toward the end of my EMS career, these 2 kids, I say kids, teenagers, older teenagers, were messing around and somebody got shot in the head. I think it was an accident. I think they were probably playing with a gun. I don't think there was any malicious intent or anything that happened, but somebody ended up with a hole in their head. And we get there, and there's still some cardiac activity. I don't know that there was a pulse, but there's still organized electrical activity happening on the monitor. His brain's literally oozing out of his skull through this hole. So, do we code this kid or not? And everybody around me was in agreement that we should not, and so we just kind of waited until the cardiac activity stopped. We went through the process of calling it. That's it. We left. See you later. Could we have scooped him up and worked him and done the whole deal and gotten him to the hospital? Yeah, I guess we could have, but it just felt like the wrong thing to do at the time. Another situation like that happened where this dude was trying to cross. If you're familiar with the area, Memorial Parkway, it's the big road that's really more like an interstate that runs right through the middle of Huntsville, and people drive at highway speed out there, even though the speed limit's really only 50. People that try to walk across that road often do not make it. And this was one of those situations where this dude was trying to walk across the parkway, got hit. And I mean, his head was just demolished, like open. His head was open. His head was exploded for all intents and purposes. But he still had some electrical activity in his heart when we put him on the monitor. And I'm like, there's no way we're doing this. This guy is dead. His heart just hasn't realized it yet, right? So I called the doctor and foolishly explained the situation just as I explained it to you, more or less. And the doctor goes, well, no, if they still have electrical activity, you need to work this. I'm like, sure, because I've already made the decision. Everybody's already leaving. We're wrapping up. They've thrown a sheet over this person. Luckily, the doctor gave me an out. They said, if you go back now and they're in asystole, then you don't have to work it. So I said, okay, great, perfect. And that's what happened. I'm not going to swear that we actually went back and checked, but that's the story and we're sticking to it. So we left. One time I had to code a guy who was very, very large. One of these situations where we would have had to probably cut a hole in the door of his apartment to get him out. He was a very, very large man in cardiac arrest. And so we go in there, we're working him, we're doing all the stuff. We're not getting any response. And in those days, just working it at the scene was not as much of a thing. The standard was to get all the stuff started, put him in the ambulance, and go to the hospital. But in this situation, we were not getting any response to our interventions. I was like, listen, there's no way. We're not doing this. We can't do this. We're not doing this. We cannot get this guy out of this apartment. It's not worth it. And so I called the doctor and spoke with them, talked it over with them, and they agreed to that as long as we stuck around for a certain period of time and did X, Y, and Z things, which we did. And so we ended up stopping our efforts and we left him right there and left. Another cardiac arrest situation. This is a big regret, actually. I was with another paramedic. It was not my turn to do patient care. This other medic was very senior to me. Maybe none of that matters. I don't know. But we got dispatched to a cardiac arrest call. In my memory, the patient was 42 years old, which at the time, when I was whatever, in my 20s, that seemed ancient to me. As I sit here now as a 43-year-old man, I'm like, 42 is young and vibrant. I may have that wrong in my memory. It may not have been 42, but at any rate, it was younger. This was not a 90-year-old person. It was a younger person. In what I could see and hear and understand, there was no reason why we should not have worked this. And my partner was like, nope, we're not doing it. We're calling it. She calls the doctor. There's a little bit of back and forth discussion. I don't know that the doctor was totally on board, but eventually she talked the doctor into it and we called it and we left and that was it. And I really wish that I had put my foot down and said, no, this is inappropriate. We're working this. You get out of the way if you want to, I'll do it. But yeah, we should have worked that. I don't know why we didn't. Still don't know why we didn't, other than laziness. One time I got called to a lady with suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation. She had called her caseworker or somebody in a similar capacity and expressed that she was going to kill herself. So we get there. She denies the whole thing. When I first started in EMS, if you said you were suicidal, you're going to the hospital, period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That rule changed during my time in EMS. They changed it to where you could not necessarily force somebody to go to the hospital just because they said they were suicidal if there was not some other reason making them incapable of consenting. But this lady would not admit to it. We stayed with her for quite a long time talking to her. So call the doctor, get permission to let her refuse transport, get our signatures, finish the paperwork. We're literally walking out the door. We're done. We are walking out the door. I look down at the coffee table and there's a note on the coffee table that is pretty clearly a suicide note. And maybe that should have changed the whole situation. Maybe I should have gone, skirt, hey, what's this? But I did not. I just kept on walking. We'd already done our stuff. We're free and clear. We're leaving. We didn't even make it out of the parking lot of this apartment complex before we got a call to go back. This lady had taken a knife, I mean a serious knife, butcher knife, and plunged it into her abdomen multiple times, stabbed herself a lot. So we run back up there. We ended up transporting her, obviously. She was alive the last time I saw her. I don't know if she survived or not, but that made me feel pretty shitty. I felt like I had already done my due diligence and gone the extra mile and all that, but could I have taken one more step and maybe changed that outcome? Yeah, maybe I could have. There was a situation a bit earlier in my career when I worked in Florence, and overnight at that time, for the whole entire city of Florence, the company that was over there at the time had 2 ALS ambulances for the entire city. There were only 2 ambulances available overnight, which was crazy in itself. But one night, the other ambulance, not my ambulance, the other one, ran a really bad trauma call kind of out toward the country, and they call us to come assist them. And the situation is the patient is sick, very sick, unresponsive. The medic's trying to get the patient intubated, but cannot get him intubated. And instead of just rolling with it, putting in a simple airway bag and getting them to the hospital, this other medic chose to sit there on scene and try to get him intubated and then call somebody else to come try to get him intubated, which, if you know anything about trauma care, is crazy. The goal is to get the people off of the scene and to the hospital. If you can't do your interventions for whatever reason, like it's more important to move your ass than it is to get any of this stuff done. Which obviously securing an airway is important, but if you can't, you can't. We didn't have RSI available at that time. I remember this particular night, it was pouring, it was storming like crazy. I don't know if we would have had a helicopter available at that time yet in that area, but there was no way we're getting a helicopter that night. I mean, there's no question they should have scooped this person up and taken him to the hospital. I don't know how long they sat out there. It was a long time before I got there. I hop in the other ambulance, and I was actually able to get the patient intubated, but I don't know how long it took. I mean, we screwed around out there for a long time, and I should have manned up and said, "Hey, no, you need to quit messing around and go to the hospital. What are you doing?" But I didn't. I fell in line again. Much more senior medic to me, so I jumped in there and helped and did what I could, and they went on their way. But that was unquestionably the wrong decision, bad situation to be involved in. I can't imagine that patient had any kind of a good outcome, but I don't know. Another thing that sometimes stuck in my mind is, what if it wasn't me that had responded to this? Because Lord knows there have been times when I just have screwed things up, I can't get an IV, or I can't get the ET tube put in, or I can't do whatever. I try and fail to do something. In Florence, at the time, there were volunteer ambulance services out in the rural part of the county that ran those areas, but they often did not have ALS providers. And so a lot of times they would call us to come intercept with them, which meant we took off and went screaming towards them as they're screaming towards us, and we stop in the median of a highway somewhere, and either we transfer the patient from one ambulance to the other, or my preference was I would take my equipment and just jump on the ambulance they were already in, and then we'd all go to the hospital together. And every once in a while, we'd get in a situation where, one of those services would be out there running a full arrest. And so I hop in there with, all my bags and my boxes, and here I am, Superman, here to save the day and run this code and just completely screw it all up. Like, I can't get an IV, I can't get an airway, I can't do anything, Putting me on this truck has just been a total waste of time, because you might as well have just BLS'd on into the hospital, because I've not done any good for you as an ALS provider. That didn't happen very often, but once in a while, I just couldn't be helpful. And in those situations, I always wonder, what if somebody else had been here and done a better job? That's a heavy thing to think about for sure. Working in the ICU as a nurse, I'm not saying this is true of every nursing job or every nurse, but in my roles that I have been in as a nurse, you're there following the rules and carrying out the orders, but there's always a doctor there, right? You're never really the one in charge making a decision, or you're just sort of carrying out orders. So in some ways, I felt a lot less responsible for the overall things that were going on. I do remember taking care of one infant in the PICU who was sick, very, very lethargic. Maybe they had RSV. I don't know what was wrong with. I don't remember what was wrong with the baby, but it was. I mean, you could look at it and tell it was very, very sick. And I was the night shift nurse, and sometimes on nights you just sort of maintain, right, all the procedures and the things that happen to progress people's care typically happen on day shift when everybody's there. Night shift is sort of a skeleton crew, and a lot of what you're doing is just kind of holding the line, right? You're just sort of maintaining until whatever's going to happen tomorrow happens. So I took care of this kid all night. Fine. I'm doing my handoff in the morning, and the day shift nurse was like, "We need to intubate this kid." And I've been looking at this kid all night, but somehow you kind of see that through somebody else's eyes, and you go, "I wonder why I didn't put my foot down and go, hey, this kid needs to be intubated." sometime in the past 12 hours. And I think they did pretty quickly. They got it intubated. So is that a situation where I should have been more of an advocate? Perhaps. I mean, it's the same doctor, right? It's the same doctor supervising the patient's care. It's the doctor that made the decision to leave it all night without intubating it. But could I have changed that situation by being more vocal? Yeah, maybe I could have. In my role now as a practitioner working in family practice, I'm not usually involved in life and death kind of situations, which at this point in my career is totally fine. I'm talking a lot about arthritis and cholesterol and blood pressure and things that are important in the long run. But most of what I do from day to day is not going to make the difference between life or death for someone, in the next, let's say, 24 hours. But one thing about having an ongoing relationship with your patients, taking care of the same population of patients, which I've never done before, is that you do get to see the consequences of your decisions, whether that's good or bad. You see the patient get better because of things that you do, or you see the patient go downhill, maybe because of things that you've done or not done, or maybe it's out of your control. But either way, you're going to know what happens with this patient down the road. There have definitely been situations where people have had bad reactions to medications that I've put them on. I've had multiple people go in the hospital after I put them on chlorthalidone. That's a thiazide diuretic, like HCTZ, but longer acting. That's a potent diuretic. Y'all be careful with the chlorthalidone now. I've had more than one patient have to go to the emergency room because their sodium and potassium were jacked up and they were very sick. Make sure people know that they still have to stay hydrated and get what they need to compensate for what this powerful diuretic is doing to them. I've kind of started shying away from it, actually. I'm not as trigger happy with the chlorthalidone as I used to be. I made a massive mistake with a patient's thyroid medicine that ended up not having any consequences, but it really could have. I guess the details aren't that important, but we ended up taking somebody off of thyroid medicine who should have been on thyroid medicine, and we were able to correct it, but it could have been really bad, and I felt really bad about it. That's probably the biggest mistake that I've made in years, definitely in my current situation, as far as I know. One of our patients a while back died after I was the last person to see them, the last medical provider to see them. I had seen them. They were sick. They ended up going to the hospital. And I will forever believe that they missed something while that patient was in the hospital. What I sent them to the hospital thinking was going on was not what they addressed. I saw them again for a follow-up. They were still very sick. I was still worried that something was going on. I ordered a study for them to be done outpatient that I thought that they should have done in the hospital, and the patient died before they got that study done. I think we all kind of collectively dropped the ball on that. We had a patient die just within the past couple of weeks here that was elderly, very elderly, at the age where anytime somebody that age drops dead, it's not exactly a surprise, but still, it makes you go, well, did I do something wrong? Did I miss something? Because of the way they died, it makes me wonder, well, gosh, maybe if I had been more aggressive with the blood pressure control, maybe this wouldn't have happened. And you can always kind of come up with a million what ifs or second guess yourself or take blame on yourself. A patient falls and cracks their hip, and maybe they do well and maybe they don't, but they're on some medicine that's on the beers list. And was the benefit of that medicine worth the risk? Did I contribute to this? Is this my fault? You can always do that to yourself. So I guess the challenge of having to deal with decisions like this all the time is to make sure that you learn from past situations without dwelling on them. I think if you get bogged down in questioning yourself, second guessing yourself, you just get paralyzed with fear or doubt, and it's hard to do anything to move forward. You always want to act in self-defense, right? You always want to overreact and do everything you possibly can so you feel like you're doing what you're supposed to do. And that's not the right reaction either. You have to think, you have to make reasonable decisions. I don't think there's ever a time where you just knee-jerk react, right? I know a lot of people are scared to see patients that have chest pain. The minute somebody hears the word chest pain, it's, oh, we got to call the ambulance and you got to go to the ER right now. And that's just not me. And I think that's because of all my past experience working in EMS, hauling people to the hospital, years and years and years of hauling countless hundreds, thousands of people to the hospital because they had chest pain who are not having a heart attack. You know what? Most people, I'm going to say this, most people who are complaining of chest pain, they're not having a heart attack. So you know what I do in my office? I see them. I evaluate them. I get an EKG. Sometimes I even check troponins and labs and whatnot. If I think they're dying of a heart attack, of course I'm going to encourage them to go to the ER. I'll drive them over there myself. I've done it multiple times. But for the most part, we can just look at the patient, evaluate the patient, use our clinical judgment, and try to actually figure out what's going on instead of overreacting. So I think those situations are examples of where I have learned from my past experience, and I can see how my current practice is different because of the things I've been through in the past. On the flip side of that coin, I'm very, very leery of people when they come in and say, "Man, I just had this heartburn, this acid reflux. I've been, eating antacid for 2 weeks and it's not getting better." Those are actually the people that I'm more prone to freaking out about and going, "Oh, you need to go to the hospital. You might be having a heart attack." Because some of the worst actual heart attacks I've ever dealt with in my career are the little old ladies who have been eating antacids for 2 weeks thinking they have indigestion and really they're having a big old MI. That's definitely a thing that I've learned over my career. That's a way that I'm changing what I do now based on what happened then. This is a pretty lame example, I guess, but one recent thing that I've changed about how I do things is that when somebody comes in with abdominal pain, of course, from an ER, from an acute care perspective, you're always thinking, well, is it appendicitis? Is their gallbladder about to rupture? Do they have a AAA? Do they have a bowel obstruction? Like you're thinking worst case scenarios always and trying to rule those things out, which is still true. But what I have come to learn is that in this primary care setting, constipation should be real high on the differential when somebody comes in with abdominal pain. And people will swear up and down that they're having big, great, huge bowel movements every day, and there's no way they're constipated. I am really tired of sending people for CT scans just to learn that their colon's full of stool and they need to take some laxative. So, what I've done? I've changed my practice. I'm still looking out for warning signs, right? I still don't want to miss the big things. If the patient looks sick, I treat them accordingly. But one thing that I've started doing a lot more of is abdominal x-rays. We are lucky enough to have an x-ray suite in our office. So I send the patient for a plain, upright abdominal x-ray. And it's just flippin' amazing how many people's colons are packed full of what appears to be poop and they are not aware of it. And I hope I've now saved people a lot of money and time and saved the healthcare system some money. Not that I care anything about saving insurance companies money, but still, I don't want to be the person who orders a bunch of unnecessary crap. And I've been able to help a lot of people by just telling them, hey, look at all this stuff in your colon. This is poop. You need to go home and take some laxative, or here's your very aggressive go lightly regimen. Go home, clean out. If you're not better, let us know. And they always get better. So yeah, I guess that's the moral of the story. If there's a point to any of this, what's done is done. You can't change past decisions. You can't make people undead once they're gone. But one of the great redeeming things about working in medicine is that chances are once you get through some kind of crappy situation, you're going to find yourself in that situation again. And the best any of us can do is just to use those crappy experiences we've had to make a better decision next time and have a better outcome for the next person we run into who finds ourselves in that situation and in need of our help. All right, that's all I got. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to our Patreon supporters, and special thanks to Rick Cornelia, my guest from last week, who inspired the idea for this episode. Hope everyone has a great week, and I'll talk to you later. I would love to share your critical incident on the podcast. If you have a story you want to tell, send it to me by email at thekppod@gmail.com. That's thekppod@gmail.com. You can send it in writing and I'll read the story. You can make a high-quality recording of yourself telling the story and I'll play that. Or I can interview you about it, either remotely or in person. Thank you for listening, and as always, stay safe, take care of yourself, and take care of your patients in that order.